Welcome to the afternoon session of our Conference on Remote Leadership. I'm Dr. Linda Risso, and I'm Senior Researcher at the CAL. This afternoon, we will pick up on some of the topics we discussed this morning and have insights from the higher education sector and the business world. Our three speakers will give their insight, and then we will have a debate at the end. So please do keep your questions coming by the Slido app. The first speaker is Dr. Sara Perry, who is Associate Professor of Management at Baylor University in the United States. She helps lead a human resource management program in the Department of Management, and she teaches courses related to talent acquisition and conflict resolution. Dr. Perry has been consulted for expertise on remote work by the New York Times, Fast Company, and numerous other press outlets. Dr. Perry earned her PhD in Industrial Organizational Psychology from the University of Houston and her Bachelor's of Science in Computer Science from the University of Missouri. Today, Dr. Perry will talk about human impact on working and leading remotely. Dr. Perry, to you.
Hello, thank you. I do my research primarily in the area of remote work and well-being of employees and leaders. So this is really a great intersection of where I spend a lot of my time. My info is there, and I'll share it at the end again as well. So I am currently in the middle of several research projects, and I'm going to share with you, in addition to some general best practices, I'm going to share with you some details of my research findings most recently. So this is a timeline that we are all familiar with. From my perspective of the research I've been doing, I'm going to share some of the steps we've been taking. So we did a survey back in December and January of US couples who were, one of them was a remote worker and worked full time. The other could be a remote worker or not. It ended up about 560 couples participated, and out of those, about 360 were dual earner couples. And so then, well, this is overall, but as we continued to collect data, the COVID outbreak began and spread, and the lockdown measures started in the US around March. And so we continued to collect data during that time. We had a lot more remote workers during that time. And at the same time, I was collaborating with some others on an international survey of how people were doing and adjusting to the sudden shift in remote work. And then in May, after the initial lockdown orders were lifted and states started doing their own thing, and every state did something different, we were continuing to collect data during that time. So at that point was when we got to the, excuse me, about 560 couples who had participated. Now, this month, we're actually following up with those couples. And I have 390 here, but we actually realized we can include those who were from before COVID as well. So we're going to see how they're doing, how things have changed for them over the past year, and how they've reacted. Out of this sample, about half of them are non-traditional or new remote workers, people who had not ever worked remotely before, and by virtue of their job were actually, had to adjust, quite a big adjustment. So that's something we're going to be following up on here, and we're actually seeking funding right now to continue that and look at some of the dynamics that have emerged, including how people take breaks in remote work and how that looks different for remote workers versus office workers. So a couple of quick findings. Who was the most well-equipped? That's the first real question that a lot of people were asking over the past year, really. So what we found in our findings over all of those efforts was that the people highlighted here really did the best in terms of the transition. They tended to report that they were enjoying, and the people listed here are primarily couples without kids or couples with kids who had extra support. So they tended to report really good outcomes and actually enjoying it in the midst of the stress of the obvious pandemic. The most challenging household types were single parents or single parents who were working, who weren't single parents, but they were working or being at home with their kids while their spouse was not there. And then just couples with kids with no extra support. And then those who were isolated, home alone. So people who were feeling a lot of that isolation really by being completely alone, especially during those initial months. And so what did we study? We looked at work-family conflict, family-to-work conflict. So these forces going back and forth between the work and home domain. People were feeling very overloaded in terms of work and family. Not a lot of support in this red box in particular, feeling like they didn't have enough support. And they also were not using their resources very well in terms of using the extra time they would find that they had in remote work, or using the extra flexibility. I'm going to talk more about that. And they didn't feel ready to work remotely during that time. And so we also looked at family dynamics. And this is something that, although it's not a organizational outcome, leaders should be really concerned about this. We found a really strong relationship between work-family conflict among these remote workers and the relationship being affected between the two partners, the spouses, and then that leading to a strong intent to quit for both partners. And that particularly was enhanced when one spouse felt that the remote worker was not pulling their weight at home, if you will. So that paper is in progress, about to be under review. We also looked at this difference between newbies and vets, we call them for short. So the new remote workers were these new people that had to really adjust pretty quickly. They had to adjust and figure out how to do all of this. So we found out that support at home and at work really mattered for them. But we also found that high schedule flexibility, too much of it, really ended up harming them. They felt like they had more work-family conflict. They felt like they had more work overload. And whereas the veteran remote workers, those who had done remote work before COVID, really, they needed more support at home. They needed more flexibility at home and in setting up the home. And that is something else I'm going to talk about as a consideration for how to do this well. So in looking at the vets specifically, those who were experienced remote workers, we found that in general, before and after COVID, they felt a lower sense of control at home once COVID, the lockdown measures happened. They had less satisfaction with their work arrangement. They did not feel they could use their resources well. That's what resourcing identity was. They didn't feel they had as much flexibility. Obviously, we were all left with less flexibility during that time. And their psychological well-being went down. They also felt there was a lot more permeability across the work and family boundary, which makes a lot of sense. A lot of interruptions from both sides into the other domain of life. Interestingly, all of these things did not change. And the asterisks indicate the levels didn't change, but how much they mattered changed. So we found different relationships before and after COVID among these things with other work and family outcomes. So a lot didn't change, but our worlds changed, the dynamics did. So I'm going to share 5 keys, and these are based on my own research, what I've talked about here and what I've done in the past, but also the broad literature on remote work. And all of these really apply to leaders as they work remotely and as they lead remotely, or as they have subordinates who are remote or distant from them. This also applies to employees. So any of us who find ourselves working from home, hopefully these will give you some good tidbits. So the first one is autonomy. We know that autonomy is important, really maybe one of the #1 factors for successful remote work. And this means giving people discretion to figure out how to get their work done. This could be schedule flexibility. This could be location flexibility, but it could also be just making decisions and determining how the work should be done. So we found, this is a paper I published in 2018, and this just shows you how the more remote you are, in general, the more autonomy you need to sustain your well-being. And you see on the y-axis here is exhaustion. So this is burnout. It's the opposite of well-being. So autonomy helps protect us in terms of well-being. Low autonomy can actually hurt us the more that we work remotely. So the key lesson here is leaders, a lot of new leaders especially, are struggling with issues of trust in their employees. The lesson is, do not try to micromanage from afar, but let's shift to a mindset of support from afar. And I'm going to talk more about some specifics on that in the next couple of tips. The next one is proactive communication. And this requires effort on both sides, the leader and the employee. So the leader really should set the tone and really even be proactive about telling their employee they need to communicate. So that this ongoing two-way performance management builds trust. So when you're working from home, you do have to be more proactive to share with your leader your outcomes, your results, the productivity, and really checking in, because a lot of us rightly or wrongly assume that out of sight is out of mind and watching Netflix on the couch. So we don't want to let anyone fall under those false assumptions or be a victim to us having that bias, which research has shown people have been more productive during COVID, even in the midst of a pandemic, that remote work has really gone well for a lot of people. So we know this can happen, but we have to communicate what we're doing, but also just to stay in touch and build that trust. The two cautions to avoid here is we want to avoid technology domination. If you don't need to be on video conference, don't require video conference. Don't overcomplicate it. Don't do things that you could just accomplish on a phone call. Don't insist that you have to have this more advanced technology like we're all getting used to now. Also, we want to avoid overscheduling. So one of the big things that's shown up in the research over the past year is an intensity of meetings, even more meetings than ever before. So we really have to be careful about that. If you don't need to have a meeting, don't have a meeting. Even if you're trying to stay in touch, figure out ways to communicate in the right amount, I guess, find that balance. Number 3 is boundary. So I have 3 types of boundaries here to consider. One is time. When you're working remotely or your employees are working remotely, you have to think about what are our working hours. And one of the big risks of remote work in general is intensification, or working more than we would have, because we don't have that clear transition of driving home from work or taking the subway home from work. So if we think about when am I going to turn it on and when am I going to turn it off, and try to keep those boundaries, that will protect employees and leaders from crossing those boundaries, whether you are impeding on someone else's home life or you are impeding on your own home life. That transition time is important. This is one of the things we heard from a lot of our participants that they were missing when they started working from home, that time when they really wound down. So that commute home, when you listen to a podcast or talk to a friend on the phone, you might have to build some of that back in once you're a remote worker. And for leaders, to encourage your employees to take proper breaks to transition from one task to another, but also to transition to home life at the end. These are some ways you can help your employees protect their well-being. Space is another one. So at home, if we don't have a lot of space, really just everything happens in the same space. And this can be a real problem for our ability to focus, but also our likelihood of burning out. So encourage, especially at the beginning, we saw leaders trying to figure this out, encouraging employees to find a space that's dedicated just for work, or at least while you're working during working hours, it's dedicated just for work. If it's the kitchen table or if you have an office, ideally having an office with a door, we all know that is ideal, but a lot of people just don't have that at home. So at least having a space you transition at the end of the day. So if you have a laptop and all of your work books or materials or whatever, be sure you put those away somewhere at the end of the day. That's another transition or a cue that now we're into off work hours, so that we don't just keep working forever 24/7. And expectations. We need to set appropriate expectations for ourselves and also for our coworkers, for our subordinates, and with our family. So one of the risks is that family, if they're also home, expect remote workers to help with other things. That was one of the things that came up in that marriage study I mentioned, that if I feel like you're here working, if I'm thinking about my spouse, but you're just working and you're not helping me, you're not making good use of your breaks to help me with what I need you to do, excuse me, when you aren't working. So being proactive about communicating those expectations, also in terms of interruptions and just norms for what you need while you work. And that leads into number 4. So we have certain needs that we may or may not know are automatically met when we go to work, when we physically go to work. And when you're a leader, one of those needs is that you see your people and thereby assume that they are being productive. And so what needs do you really need to make up for, or compensate for, or have met in a different way? I have a picture here of just a couple of office spaces, as simple as an office space. If you think about being in your office and not being interrupted by your kids, that's a need that's met when you come to work instead versus when you work at home and you never get that separation. Another one would be just the interaction. So isolation is a big concern in remote work, and leaders can help facilitate ways to facilitate connections. So some have done this through virtual, social hours, even just coffee chats, the time when you're going to come, not necessarily talk about work, but you're going to maintain that social interaction. That also helps innovation. That helps us stay on good terms with each other so that we can have more impromptu brainstorming and innovating. Another way to think about this is, what do you need to ask for? You can ask for it from your work or your leader. You can ask for it from your family. And this might be that you need certain equipment. It might be that you need certain boundaries set, those expectations that we talked about. So you might need to think about what you have to ask for that you wouldn't have to ask for at home. One really tangible example was that I experienced early on was having 2 screens. I have 2 screens in my office at work, and I didn't at home. I was working off a little laptop screen in addition to a very uncomfortable chair. So these very tangible things that our workplace could help us with, and many did during this past year. I ended up bringing my screens home so that I was going to be working from home anyway, and our workplace said, take your stuff home if you need it. The next thing to think about is, what can you do? So needs and resources in terms of your flexibility. How can you use your time and flexibility in ways that actually help you, but also help those around you? So meeting goals for yourself, for your family, for your work. Remote work breaks are different than in-office breaks. And this is a project I'm working on right now. Using our breaks wisely, we found that people who use their breaks specifically for self-care and non-work goals, like making plans with family, scheduling dentist appointments, things like that, both of those together actually resulted in the best outcomes. And I'll show you a picture. If you look at the red circle, this is the less optimal. So we looked at how the way you use breaks affects how you view the stress you experience in remote work. And so the red indicates kind of more undesirable outcomes. Specifically, hindrance appraisal is looking at stress as a bad thing. Challenge appraisal is looking at stress as a good thing. So we want to look at stress as a way, the stressors that we experience could help us grow and learn and become a better professional, whereas hindrance stressors, all they do is burn us out. So the green circle is it reflects when people use breaks for both self-care and non-work goals. When they do that, they tend to view stress in a more positive light. And then finally, the last key is that this will be different for every subordinate you have. So every person needs something just a little bit different. So I talk about this as individualized consideration. And what you see in this graph is the outcome is autonomy, need, satisfaction. This is just illustrating a point as one example that people who are lower in the personality trait of emotional stability, this is from the Big 5 topology of personality. If they're lower in emotional stability, they actually need less autonomy. They get their need for autonomy met much quicker than someone who's higher in emotional stability. So remember, I started at the beginning. The first key was you need to give people autonomy. And this is the caveat. Not everyone wants a lot of autonomy. And what this means is we have to figure out how to support people from afar in the way that they need. So some people do great with 100% autonomy. Leave me alone. I don't need interaction or interference. But others really need support and guidance along the way, especially as they're working remotely. So that leads us to just a quick conclusion, something to reflect on as we go, to discuss expectations in a way that we know a lot of things are coming in on us right now. There's just a lot of stress and a lot of demands, and there are limited resources to deal with these. So having conversations with your employees about that can be a hugely valuable exercise. It can also help build trust and mutual respect, the fact that you care enough to talk about these things. Also, as we move forward, leaders really need to facilitate this process of learning. What have we learned from the past year? What do we know now about remote work that we didn't know before? What works well? What doesn't work well? What have we done in our pivot that has really been good for all of us? What do we need to keep doing? What do we need to avoid resuming? And then finally, checking in on each other. What can we learn from those who are handling this well? And what can we do for those who are not doing so well right now, who's struggling, and how can we help them? So with that, we have a little bit of time. If anyone, I've seen the chat come in. I haven't been reading them, but if anyone wants to ask any questions, or Dr. Rizzo, if you want to facilitate any questions, we can do that.